Well, thank you for staying with us on the AM show. We get into our big stories. We'll be bringing you the Arise Ghana demonstration later on the show. But for now, we're going to be focusing on the electronic levy. On May the 1st, we had it rolling out. The question is, 2 months into the enforcement of the electronic levy, what is it yet to yield? Is it meeting its target? What are the critical questions we should be asking as a country as we contemplate this levy? Well, joining us for the conversation, we have former Minister for Finance and Economic Planning, Seth Terkper. He joins the conversation. We also have Eric Amponsa-Boateng, a tax analyst who joins the conversation. Both of them here with us. Gentlemen, a very good morning to you. I know you may be in different timelines, but it's morning here, so I'm wishing you a good morning. And thank you for connecting with us.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm actually in Ghana, so I'm in the same timeline.
Okay, all right. I know you globetrot a lot. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your time. Let's start with a proper appreciation of the E-Levy. And I know it will be a bit difficult for you gentlemen because we don't have real facts and figures from the central bank, for example, out there for us to reflect on. Because Seth, for example, I know you would have liked to look at all the line items, look at the revenue that has been generated before you make your analysis. But we have two major components to look at. Imani Africa, I'm sure you've seen that latest release where they say that E-Levy, as far as the mobile money interactions, have dropped by some 83%, which means that we are recouping just about 17%. Then again, we would have this latest post by Gabi Asare Ochre-Darko, who is, well, a stalwart of the NPP. And he suggests that just about 10%, only 10%, is being raked in. So where we're estimated to have made about 600 million Ghana cedis, it is only 60 million we have brought in. And that would make for quite a reading, wouldn't it? But I'll start with you, Seth Terkper. What would it mean if it turns out to be the truth? Whether we are getting 17% as per Imani Africa's survey on the E-Levy, or 10% as per the survey-less post by Gabi Asare Ochre-Darko. What would be your reflection on it?
My short answer is that it will still be immaterial.
It will still be immaterial?
In the context of the economic situation, that we see ourselves in at the moment. And I have made this point. First, I have said that the E-Levy is already factored as part of the 100 billion Ghana cedis, equivalent of 20% of GDP, when all that we are able to do is 13 to 15% of GDP revenue, which has been stagnant at that level, or tax revenue, slightly below. And therefore, if you consider that the deficit we were confronted with, the likely increase in debt, the borrowing, already had the E-Levy factored into it. In fact, the E-Levy is bringing in 1.4%. 1.4% of GDP. What's different?
That is, you're looking at the component of 100.5 billion, 100.05 billion. That's what you're computing.
Right. Yes. If you go to the appendix to the budget, you will see of which E-Levy, which means that it is already part of the 100 billion. And remember that 100 billion revenue has a significant shortfall of compared to revenue of about 137 billion. By our estimation, is about 143 to 45 billion because of what we thought was either an arithmetical error, which needs to be corrected. We are waiting for mid-year. So I'm saying that if you consider that the deficit itself was 11 to 13% by government's own admission, and likely to reach 15%, then how does 1.4% of GDP, how does it help the economy? If we take the government's medium term, which is in the budget, which is what we have now to see where government wants to land this economy. In terms of percentage of GDP, again, in the appendix, it is still 1.4. In fact, it is 1.4 for 2022 and 1.4 all the way to 2025. So if that is what government was expecting, I am saying that the E-Levy in substance was not going to help us out of, the crisis, and I kept saying this. So all that a shortfall, whether it is 10%, whether it is 50%, or what we may be seeing as maybe 60 to 70%, because the tax has not stabilized yet, would only worsen, the fiscal situation, because it was not meant to have helped it substantively, despite everything that was being said, that it will create employment, it will do infrastructure and all that. No. Yes, infrastructure, if you're talking about minor infrastructure, which makes a difference, like elementary schools and the rest, yes, it makes a difference.
Seth, pardon the interjection, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying it was 1 point something percent, the entire E-Levy, because just walk me through this. And I may not be an economist. I have a fair knowledge, so just hold my hand, because you are the expert here. If you look at 100.5 or 100.05 billion, and you consider that the E-Levy initially was supposed to rake in something close to 7 billion, 6.9 billion. And then it was, revised to about 4.5 to 5 billion, interacting with Dr. John Kuma, Deputy Finance Minister. You would be looking at least something around 4.5 to 5%. Or am I getting something wrong?
No, we are expressing it as a percentage of GDP. So let's focus on that. Right. I'm saying that first, your 100 billion approximately is the equivalent of 20% of GDP.
Right. Okay, now, so I now get the understanding. I didn't hear it as an expression of the GDP. I now get what you mean.
Yes, it's an expression of the GDP.
Right, go ahead. Please go ahead.
And so I'm saying that, and if it's the equivalent of 20% of GDP, total revenue, including the E-Levy, what is the E-Levy's contribution? It is 1.4% of GDP. That is what the approximately 7 billion gives you. My other point is that, therefore, if you are looking at the difficulty facing the nation today, it is that we have a high deficit because the expenditure is about 143 billion, right? Much, much above, almost, well, let's take government figures. It's 137 billion, which we dispute anyway. Now we are saying that, therefore, you have a gap of 37 billion. So in terms of salvation, where we are today, yes, E-Levy is contributing, maybe 7 billion of that. But I'm saying it's still 1.4. And if you look at the deficit again in percent of GDP, right, which is the denominator we often use, that itself is between 11 and 13% of GDP. Now, if you make adjustments to arrears, which are significantly low, include bailout costs, which should have been added but was subtracted, right? Then you are talking about, 15% or so of GDP. So I'm saying that the budget structure itself that we had, including the E-Levy, was already onerous, because we are looking at a gap, of let me be conservative, 11%, out of which E-Levy, which is already in the revenue before you calculated this figure, is contributing 1.4%. Right? So I would say it was overhyped to begin with. That's my first point on the numbers. Then my second point, which I am making, is that if you look at the fact that it takes 2 to 3 years to get out of where you are, because we have had 17 programs and it's not for nothing, maybe 19. So it's not for nothing. You learn from these things. It takes you 2 to 3 years to get out of the situation, which is why IMF programs have always been, minimum, 2.5 years, 3 years, right? I'm saying that medium term, which takes us to say 2020, assuming we did an IMF program today, the negotiations and everything will take us into third quarter. So the program might come on effectively end of the year. But of course, the fund was in town, on a staff visit. If it's turned into Article 4, then they have the numbers already. So it could be accelerated. So assuming we went into an IMF program, let's say somewhere in the third quarter, then we're talking about a program that would overlap 2023, 24, 25, if you take a minimum of 3 years. And I'm saying that is precisely what our medium-term budget also covers. So what does E-Levy tell us in that medium term? The E-Levy is stagnant by the government's own estimation. The nominal figures go up, but when you calculate as a percentage of GDP, it is still 1.4%. And we know that the deficit into the medium term, and considering that we've not been able to go to the market for refinancing, it's already a tough medium term, which is why we went through the ratings degradation, and we went through, we do not have market access. The markets don't believe it. So I'm saying that the E-Levy is already there. It has been factored into the condition which is leading to our inability to go to the markets to borrow for the budget. Then my final quick point is that, by way of introduction, is that the opposition to E-Levy by some of us is technical. For the first time, we are taxing savings, right? I heard on your sister, Joy morning show, someone saying that, the money in my own wallet, if I transfer it, is being taxed. So if a businessman, decides to transfer money to pay wages, and that could be a loan that he had taken an overdraft, it attracts E-Levy. Since when did we start taxing, loans, savings, and the rest?
So I think that conversation. I think that conversation has been had even from the very outset when we were talking about the implementation of the E-Levy. Yes. But then if the numbers turn out to be true, and we've heard the likes of Gabi Asare-Otridaku say that, well, the fact no one likes taxes, and so the fact that maybe we are not raking in what we expected does not mean it is a bad tax. Is there any such thing as a bad or failed tax? And in this instance, when you have a tax,
there's something like a bad tax. Let me give you 2 examples in our history. As I said, we've been very careful not to tax savings. And another reason why it's a bad tax, secondly, is that you try not to discriminate among your citizens.
Right.
And so if I get my money under the pillow, my example, when we had this discussion, if I have my money under the pillow and I take it out cash and I go and buy, I don't pay E-Levy. If I have my money in the bank and I go and withdraw it to make payment, I don't pay E-Levy. And if I have my money and I write a check or decide to ask the bank to do their traditional transfer before this, they also got onto the, the MTN and others, which option I have, I don't pay E-Levy. Right? In fact, if I enter a shop and I pay the, I take cash and pay, and somebody standing by me picks the same shoe, right, and pays for it. Between the two of us, the one who is paying by Momo, is paying a tax.
So would you call this, just to move the conversation forward, would you call the E-Levy, like you said, you listened to our sister station on radio and someone was talking about even an overdraft and having to pay tax on that. Would you call the E-Levy a bad tax? And now that it's not raking in the expected returns, is it a failed tax on the back of that, at least per what we know now?
No, let me be careful here. Let me just say that it is badly designed. That's it. Because there is nothing like an inherent bad tax until you begin to look at the deficiencies of the tax. And a good example, by the way, all these electronics we didn't have it. Yes, DSTV and others, at the time we were doing the V80. They were separate taxes.
And I was about to get to exactly that.
Yes.
I was about to get to exactly that. The V80 also got a lot of flack at the time in the 90s when, from 95 onwards when we started with, talk about the E-Levy. And we saw the demonstrations that followed. But yet, today, it is something that has been integrated into our system, and we accept it, we pay it. In fact, it has been increased, the V80. So, I mean, what is the difference? What differences do you see, very briefly, in about a minute, between the V80, which people, pushed back against, and the E-Levy, which people have also pushed back against? Will it catch on with time, do you think?
It might catch on because it is draconian. I don't have an option. My only option is to opt out. right, and not use the service, right? In the interest of disclosure, I was a national coordinator when the VAT was introduced. So let me just make that disclosure. Many years younger than. The difference between the V80 and E-Levy is that, if it were on, say, banking fees like V80 and registered, which is what we wanted to do in 2015, you get a credit. When a businessman pays VAT and the businessman is registered, the tax is a consumption tax, right? So VAT is a consumption. For that reason, the businessman is allowed to offset the tax they pay, the VAT they paid on inputs against the VAT they paid on outputs. Otherwise, they will add it to cost. You don't have that option with levies. That's the primary difference. That is the superiority of VAT, and which is why it's not going away, and it's not going to go away, because businessmen like it. So when we block NHIL and Get Fund, from the businessmen from claiming credit, remember when we changed it to straight levies, we blocked their access to refunds and credit. And that made that aspect of the VAT a bad tax, because then they lost. And it is not bringing in revenue. Government should have learned from it. In fact, as we speak today, income tax, right? Corporate income tax and personal income tax is generating more revenue. Is that where we want to go?
Right.
Our VAT is the broadest tax base. So in terms of design, is that where we want to go as a nation? Because of the plethora of levies and the rest. And today, if a businessman, my last point, if a businessman has to comply with their tax obligations, and if GRA has to go and conduct examinations, they are dealing with no less than 10 different tax returns. One of the advantages of VAT was that it brought all of these, and you use only one VAT return. Today, we are going back to the Kumi Preku days. When we used to, in fact, when what we call the SAD, I was part of those reforms, the standard administrative document, or what we commonly call the customs entry, was designed. It brought together 11 different forms, I remember very well, and designed it to one form to make it easy. Right. And that's one of the things with the VAT, did. Today we've gone back with all from pollution levy to whatever levy, the existing communication, you have to file returns for all of this. Yes, they may be on a single, form, but then that's the complexity that you are introducing.
Very poignant, introductory remarks. I'll come back to you with other angles of the conversation, but let me also bring in Eric Amponsah-Boateng, who is a tax analyst. Eric, thank you for patiently staying with us. I'd like to find out from you, if it turns out that the information we're getting is in fact true, a 17%, positivity rate as far as the E-Levy is concerned, per what Imani Africa says, and maybe as low as 10% per what Gabi Otredako is suggesting, maybe testing the waters, but he must have had some facts to play with. What would this indicate of this specific tax? Because, and I pose that question in a broader context. We've seen what has happened in the sub-region and in the region generally, where similar taxes have been implemented on different fronts at much lower levels, and we've seen the pushback from people. So what would this mean if this turns out to be true?
Thank you very much. Good morning to your viewers and your listeners. Well, what I would say is that, first of all, we need to look at our tax to GDP ratio in Ghana. At the moment, it's 12%. And then for sub-Saharan Africa, it is 22%. What does this tell us? It means that there are a lot more people in Ghana who are not paying their taxes. And so if I hear people in the local news that we expect from the E-Levy, you're not getting them. Basically, I think that, first of all, if you need to be able to implement a tax policy and rake in the needed revenue, you must first of all engage the stakeholders, the ordinary man on the street, the Makola business woman, consultants, business owners, and all that. The other issue is that before any tax policy can be implemented and it will be successful, we need to have what we call tax compliance. And tax compliance will be effective only when you start with a lower rate. And if you agree with me, the last time that we spoke on this issue, what I said was that, in opinion, yes, the E-Levy is a good policy, because if you read the whole document, it's saying that the idea basically is raking a lot more people who are in the informal sector. Okay, so from my perspective, I think that we still need to look at the E-Levy very well. If you tell me that it's a bad tax policy, I will.
I missed that. I missed that point.
And I believe
the connection is a bit
go
patchy, Eric.
About it in
hello,
a proper way.
Hello.
We will be able to rake in.
The connection is a bit patchy. So just repeat what you said for me. Just repeat what you said for me, Eric, if you can hear me. Well, we'll come back to Eric to share his thoughts on this. Is that Eric?
Hello?
Is that Eric?
Yes. I think where I am, probably the network.
Yes. The connection is not too good. I missed the last point you were making. I just wanted you to go back.
We're able to. Is it better?
All right, Eric, we'll try to come back to you so that you can make the point. But if you can hear me, I was just trying to get you back. You were talking about it may not necessarily be a bad tax, but we lost all of that in transition because of the poor connection. So we'll try to reconnect with you. But in the meantime, we also have Dr. Theo Champong, an economist, joining the conversation. Dr. Theo Champong, thank you for joining us. We're contemplating the E-Levy from the perspective of what we know so far. What has been put out there. We've not heard from the central bank. That's a given. But Imani Africa has conducted a survey. We're raking in maybe about 17%. What would that mean? We have a stalwart of the MPP posting on Twitter that we could be raking in as low as 10%. Now, even for those who were against the policy or the levy, this is low. What would that mean for you, for starters, for this conversation, if they turned out to be true?
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. And I see Uncle Seth also in there. For a quick disclaimer, I was actually part of the Imani team that did this survey,
right?
And designed and basically supported its rollout. The findings is not that you are seeing a 17% attrition. So I think it's important to clarify that. What we asked was, do people support that 1.5% E-Levy tax? And when you add those who are strongly against and those who are somewhat not in support,
right,
that comes to about 83%. So basically 8 in 10 of the respondents, and we polled close to 1,700 people,
right,
plus or minus 2% margin of error, indicated that they are not in support of the E-Levy. Then we asked further questions. Okay, so if you are in support or you're not in support, what are your reasons? And has the volume of your transaction also reduced? So that's why I think really the pertinent issue is that for many people, whether they'll be willing to pay the E-Levy, clearly they said no, because the government is already collecting enough taxes. And let not us be confused by the fact that the tax to GDP ratio may be low, but Ghanaians are paying a lot of other indirect, taxes, right? In that regard, people pay V80 at the pump. When you buy things, you pay on that. And for me, the E-Levy is already adding or compounding this issue. And this whole idea of taxing the informal economy, I struggle to really accept that argument, because the way the E-Levy is actually rolled out currently, I don't think that you're actually going to be able to reach that segment of the population that ostensibly you want to reach out to. In fact, many of those who would be paying and are paying now are largely in the formalized structure of the economy.
So you fundamentally disagree with what Eric was sharing initially, that, I mean, when you compare the sub-region, the average in terms of tax to GDP is 22%. Our average is 12%. And so that in itself means that we're not necessarily paying.
It's potentially an issue, but
over
the
top.
solution is an issue. The solution to that is not e-levy. The solution to that is, if you go back to the last IMF program that Ghana exited from, there were 3 issues that we needed to resolve. Restore debt sustainability, strengthen monetary policy, and clean up the banking system. And at the debt sustainability bit, they actually raised 2 important points. And they said, to raise revenue, government must crack down on 1, tax evasion, and number 2, rationalize all the exemptions that we've been given. And if you do the estimate and some numbers, we can actually raise as much money as we're getting if you crack down on the loopholes and, you know, a lot of the inefficiencies within the system, than bringing in a new tax handle that otherwise would even derail your whole kind of digitalization effort in that regard. And that is what you're seeing really with this e-levy thing here, where again the survey shows you very clear that 8 in 10 of the respondents, or 83, who say, well, we're not in support of the tax, if you ask them, have your consumption patterns changed? Clearly, they're saying that they have reduced the volume of transactions that they're making. We didn't ask them the value of the transaction. But if you have reduced the volume of your transactions, what it stands to reason, and
naturally, the volume would also be affected.
The official 24% attrition rate that the government gave as what would be the fallout of the e-levy from the first 3 to 6 months is probably not going to hold water. And so we are likely to earn far lower amounts than what has currently come through in terms of the numbers. So I am not surprised that we're getting a very strong sort of consumer pushback in terms of the sentiment survey that we carried out. But secondly, I don't think that if we want to raise more taxes, the solution necessarily is the e-levy.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Let me engage let me engage Eric Amponsah-Boateng, who was having a bite earlier, and owing to a poor connection, we couldn't hear him. Now, you've heard Theo Echampong, Dr. Theo Echampong, who is saying, well, the fact that we have a regional average of 22% and ours is 12% is not really reflective, looking at the number of taxes we are paying on fuel, on this, on that, on practically everything. What is your quick reaction? Hello, do we have Eric Amponsah-Boateng with us?
Yes. The point that I was trying to make earlier on is the fact that we have not been able to find enough revenue regarding the e-levy because of 2 things. One, I think that we did not engage the stakeholders, business owners, the market women, and all that. But I believe that we are not there yet. The solution, in my opinion, is to mobilize revenue domestically. And how do you do it? How do you do it? You have to make sure that you use a tax policy. And I think that the e-levy is one of them. Now, he was making the point that we need to cut down the loophole, or probably ensure that when it comes to government expenditure. But the question is that if you do not raise the revenue, how do you spend it? You can only spend what you have. So I am saying that we can even begin to discuss this issue about cutting down on government expenditure when you've been able to raise the revenue. And so if we are able to do that, then what it means is that is why inflation is on the rise. That is why the cedi is becoming weaker and weaker, because we are not able to raise the revenue. And, when we're able to raise the revenue, government will be able to spend. And that is what makes output increase. And once these outputs are able to be sustained, then we have economic growth and development, which will have a large impact on the economy. So that is what I would say. I think that most people say that the e-levy is about Momo. Momo is just one aspect of the e-levy. But you find that most people always say that momo, momo, momo. Yes, the momo, because probably a lot more people use the momo as a means of making payment. Now, earlier on, the former finance minister was making reference to the point that if you go to a shop and then he is going to pay with a cash, and somebody goes there and that person is going to pay with the momo. The issue is that if you sit in your home, you can make an order, okay, and then that item will be brought to you. You can make payment online. We must know that if you have to move to the shop yourself, one, you're going to drive. You're going to incur cost, your fuel, and all that. Even the risk involved in driving. So yes, the E-Levy is there. But if you want to avoid it, you can do so. Nobody is saying that pay it at all costs. Okay, so the difference between the E-Levy and probably the VAT is the fact that the VAT is a consumption tax. Because that, look, there are some items, whether you like it or not, you would have to buy them. But if you are to make the payment, you can either decide to use the momo to pay, or you think that the person is just around the corner, walk to the person and pay.
Okay, so do you think the E-Levy may, even for a long while, if we keep it, rake in much less for the state because of its level of optionality, if I may put it that way? With that, there's a wider range. With the E-Levy, it is more constrained. Bank transactions and mobile money transactions. Is that one of the things, one of the causes?
Yes, it is happening because initially government probably didn't do the right thing. So you agree with me, look, if you are started with a very low rate, I'm sure most people would have probably bought into the idea. And even now, let's be frank with you, people have shied away from using the movement. But after a while, when they step back and find that if I want to send physical cash to the person, I'm going to spend money for transportation and all that. Okay, so it's even more safer, it's more convenient. The reason why we are experiencing what we are experiencing is the fact that people did not get the education that they needed. And then more importantly, the rate, which in my opinion is still too high. You agree with me that the last time that I spoke on this issue, I recommended 0.75. When you start with that figure, people will at all costs, most people they will comply. And once they comply, after a while, then you can decide to increase the rate. We haven't done well in terms of raising the revenue because, in my opinion, I think that the 1.5% is still too high. And also the threshold of the 100 cedis a day. So that is what I would say.
All right. So my final bit to you briefly. Would you suggest, as a tax expert, as an analyst, in an instance like this, if this were to continue, if the attrition rate is very high, I mean, if we're seeing a lot of people not, cutting corners just to avoid the E-Levy, and if we're raking in so little from it that it becomes a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, you've won, but there's no so much to the win. What would you propose? Should we scrap it? Or should we reduce it to maybe a 0.5 or a 0.25 like we've seen other countries do in this jurisdiction? What for you would have been, if you had been consulted on this, what would be your proposal? Because mind you, even before you come through with an answer, people are complaining that we have too many taxes, that the times are really hard. Look at the fuel composition, for example, and the tax burden there. Utility providers also want more. So when you consider that mix, what would you have proposed?
Okay, thank you. People are complaining because the rate is still too high. And like you rightly mentioned, if we were to start with probably 0.5, we wouldn't be facing the challenge that we are facing now. I think that we can still look at other options. Okay, so personally, the way forward is to educate all of us and also reduce the rate probably to the 0.75 that I recommended earlier. And then government can also look at other means of raising revenue. And one of them is to review the tax exemption, okay, especially those that we give to these multinational companies that are owned by foreigners. Because at the end of the day, whatever money that they make, they move these funds out. And that does not help our economy to grow. We can also look at the payee very well. You agree with me that despite all the challenges that we have, or the ideas that we put on board, the PAYE still gives Ghana the highest in terms of the revenue. And my observation about the PAYE is that most people even do not deduct the right amount, okay, that they pay to the GI. And I remember about 10, 15 years ago, when I was working with the then IRS, I observed that it was happening. And therefore, I made a recommendation, and then we put in place what we call the payroll auditor. And what we were doing at the time was that when you bring your PAYE schedule, we take the soft copy. The payroll auditor is able to run through it. Even if you have about 5,000 employees, it will run through the whole system, and it will generate what we call the result. So it will show each person whether you are under deducting or over. And at the end of the day, to give you a summary. And we found out that most state organizations were not deducting the right amount. So this is an area, I've mentioned it several times, we have to look at that. And then finally, we must probably revisit the free zone, the concept. It is being abused. And probably we also need to look at the VAT refund. We have to do a proper audit before these payments are made. So that is what I would say for now.
All right. Let me bring in Seth Tekwe, former Minister of Finance. And a pointed question to you. If you were at post right now, faced with these difficulties, faced with what economic challenges we have to grapple with, and the E-Levy was not yielding the desired results as we have it. We don't have it factually from the central bank, but these are some surveys and what they have, evinced, what they have demonstrated to us. What would have been your reaction?
We had, when the VAT was revamped in 2013, the new law, we had something called V80 on non-core financial services. Let me emphasize, non-core financial services. The core financial services, as I was saying, are your savings. The core financial services, include, the typical one, and includes interest, because interest is not consumption. Until you take your interest, you earn from the bank out and you go and consume it, or you go and invest, you make a profit, then you pay the tax. But what we included in the VAT Act, which was repealed in 2017, was for banks to impose a tax on fees and services. If you use an ATM, if you use it, because that is consumption. And that is consistent with a general consumption tax. But the beauty of it is that banks which were not claiming input tax credit, and he mentioned refunds, including refunds on those services, would have apportioned the input for the core and the non-core, and they would have taken the credit. So it makes it even more efficient. Today, with the E-Levy, they cannot do that. MTN cannot, with all the services they are rendering, they are providing inputs in rendering the services, in monitoring and providing returns and everything. Any service they buy, consultancies, whatever, any material they buy, stationery, others, they are paying the VAT. So what you are having today is that those things which would have had a credit, do not, the credit is blocked, just like as I explained, the NHI and the Get Fund, which was blocked in expectation that when you block it, then you get more revenue. You are not getting revenue. So we did have an alternative, which was repealed in 2017. And that is consistent with, it's also consistent with, when you talk about expanding the tax base, mind you, it is not just about the informal sector all the time. Because many of the people in the informal sector, if they were to file their returns, as you do in the UK and Ethiopia and Birmingham, in the US, as you may know from friends and the rest, That is why in every April, many informal people are filing their returns. Why? Because they are going to get a refund. So if we had an efficient tax system, many of the people who are in the formal sector will get a refund for some of the taxes which they are paying today, including the presumptive income tax. If you gave them a fair chance, and they went to their tax, analysts and the rest. But that can be for another conversation on tax. Now, look, the point is we are making is that you don't chase a tax just because you want to rake in revenue. You expand the tax, but you streamline it to serve an objective. As I said, general consumption tax, anybody, if you go and pay accounting services, if you go and pay consultancy fees, multimedia to an expert and to others, you are required to pay VAT. And you can withdraw and you can, get a credit, for the tax that you pay on inputs. And so when we have a new economy, like the financial sector, petroleum services, and the rest, VAT is non-discriminatory. VAT says your consumption, once you are consuming, it doesn't matter whether you are buying a shoe, you are buying paper, you are buying, if you are a consumer, you pay the tax on it. That's what I meant, by the discrimination compared to E-Levy. So taxes must be efficient, they must be non-discriminatory, and that's the point. Let me make a quick correction. The 20% is revenue, it's not tax to GDP ratio. The sub-Saharan African average is between 15 and 17, and half percent. The middle income countries like Kenya and the rest, it's only South Africa and Mauritius and others who are close to 20%. The rest of the middle income countries are between 15 and 17.5%.
Which would suggest if it's between 15 and 17%, we're still low, but it's not as low.
They are still low, precisely. That's the point.
Right.
And Ghana used to be in that range. Now, one of the reasons, and he did mention it, it's a valid point, was that you remember West Blue, you remember, which is now Icons. You remember those automation that were single window. That was a customs equivalent of automation after the creation of GRA. And then the merger of IRS and the VAT service. Now there was to be a equivalent domestic tax system, for the merged domestic tax division, right? Which did not continue after 2017. I hear that bits and things are being considered. That is the system you need. And that would enhance the example he was giving. That is filing electronically the PAYE, and then because, let's take the controller, which deducts PAYE. You have a survey and whatever, so immediately somebody files a PAYE, you are able, and that's what's done in the advanced countries. You are able to bring together, you get my PAYE, right? Yes. But you also get some income which I have earned, on which withholding has been done, logged into the system. So with my tax ID number, which is now the national identification number, you are able to survey all my activities. And that is what enhances audit. So it is about time we look at that, because the enhancement, of taxes is not just about policy. It's not just about tax instruments. Right. It's also about effective administration. So let's give GRA the wherewithal. That was going to be the modernization phase 2. The first phase was the creation of GRA, the revamp of all the tax laws, and the merger of IRS, yes. So my point in summary is, quite apart from the low expectation, I guess the design of the E-Levy, and let's be careful in comparing ourselves to other countries. They may not have the same design. It's also not about low rates, right?
Okay.
So so it is a matter of design we have to revisit.
All right. I want us to move the conversation on to the angle of the IMF and, the proposals of the likes of economists, Dr. Pepra, among others, about going there now. But before I do that, Dr. Theo Champong, for you, I'd like to find out if these figures, what we are seeing, turn out to be true, and if what we are gleaning from mobile money transactions and other electronic transactions from the banks, if people are moving away this much from the electronic systems, would you say that on the back of that, if this persists, let's say till end of year, we should reduce the rate or scrap it altogether as a, quote, nuisance tax?
I mean, for me, in principle, and my position on this is very clear. I am against the e-levy because I see it as a tax grab of people's savings, because there's no value that is being created, one. And then number two, even if you consume a digital financial services, why must the tax even be more than the other amounts you're paying for the consumption of that service, right? Where the government has actually not created any value at all. That's my principled position on this. However, I also recognize that we're in difficult times, and in that regard, I also then said the rate or the trigger point for the tax has to be significantly reduced. I am on record as having said a 0.5% perhaps could be an agreeable middle of the way solution in this regard, and that may actually get a bit more of the revenues than what currently we're getting at the moment. But fundamentally, personally, I'm against the e-levy just because I don't see it being tied to value creation and any of the principles of taxation that I know and I was taught, is not tied to that. There are revenue issues, and to address that, the government recently, I think there was an article on Bloomberg where it indicated that they're looking to raise some bridging or syndicated loans to be able to meet the budgetary needs of the country, just because the Eurobonds route at the moment seems a bit, challenging for them. And then, of course, there's the big elephant in the room as well, that should Ghana go to the IMF or not, particularly given some of the recent indicators pointing, showing a bit more of a negative trend. So an example being the import cover of the country reducing from about 5 months of import cover. Now we're talking almost 3.7 or 3.6 months of import cover. And if that continues, where the central bank is burning through a lot of its reserves to prop up the city and the economy, then we might be heading for some liquidity challenges and some balance of payment crisis in the coming months.
And that brings me to the very next area I want us to look at, the IMF. And it appears, yes, we've spoken about it time and again from the days of structural adjustment in the 80s. We've demonized it in certain contexts, and we've done well with it, so to speak, in other contexts, regardless of the stringent conditions that we have to follow. But here is the picture, and you started painting it. When it comes to our net foreign reserves, we've bitten through it quite extensively. Per what I have here, as of January, what we had stood at around 6.09 billion American dollars. Currently, we're looking at around 4.672 billion in terms of our net reserves. At the same time, of the $450 million that the BDCs, the bulk oil distribution companies, need, for example, which is also impacting the value of the dollar versus our currency, we're giving them just about 21, 22%. So some have suggested, Dr. Theo Champo, like your colleague, Dr. Pepra, that, look, go to the IMF. This is the surest way of boosting your foreign currency reserves and also stabilizing your economy as a result, handling the CD, and from there, you can have some stability. Is that a point you agree with?
Sorry, my microphone was off. I mean, going to the IMF, there's always a trade-off that needs to be taken into account with these decisions. Immediately, yes, we could possibly, if we went under an extended credit facility or the other one, EFF arrangement, possibly maybe between 2 and 3 billion come through for us, and that helps meet the balance of payments issues. But fundamentally, what would have to implement in terms of the structural reforms, and I recall very well some of the interventions that Uncle Seth made back in 2015 thereabout, with some of those homegrown policies and cutting back on expenditure and trying to rationalize wages, and also importantly, having to actually safeguard some of the pro-poor policies or interventions in that regard. Those are things that would have to be discussed or negotiated as part of any potential package. But for sure, there would be trade-offs, and we then have to work out what the net benefit would be for us as a country. But at this moment, looking at some of the government talk and some of the interventions, I think we are seeing a bit of a softening of the stance in terms of trying to potentially go to the fund for some program or not.
All right, let me bring in Eric. At this point, like Dr. Theo Champong suggests, we could have gone on the international market with a bond system to have got in some liquidity to shore up the economy. Unfortunately, that route is not available as of now. Some have suggested that even when it comes to the IMF program, we should have forecast early that this would happen and have gone to the IMF much earlier, and that this makes matters even more difficult. So tell me, is it the way to go currently, looking at where our economy is headed, to go the way of the IMF? Is it a bit too late? What is your take on that? What is your reflection?
Early for us to even think about going to the IMF. The reason is simple. We have not been able to...
Pardon me, I missed the start. Did you say we shouldn't contemplate going to the IMF?
Yes, I'm saying yes, we should not. Because we have not been able to exhaust all the means by which you can raise revenue internally. You see, when you are able to raise revenue internally, it leads to economic growth. And once you're able to sustain that growth, then it leads to economic development. Let's not forget that if you have to go back to the IMF, they're going to give us certain conditions, and we still have to pay the interest on those loans. So I would say that we have not still gotten to the point where we should even think of going to the IMF. And then I also want to correct a point that Mr. Chapter made earlier on. He was trying to compare the E-Levy and the V80, which have to do with input and output. He will agree with me that now, if you look at the corporate tax, we have the National Fiscal Stabilization Levy. Okay, for levies, it's just a one-off thing. And so if you look at even the National Fiscal Stabilization Levy, it's just 5% of your profits before tax. So if you want to make that comparison, you will get it wrong. The other issue is that the E-Levy doesn't...
Are we comparing, sorry to interject, I know we have very limited time on this. Are we comparing direct tax principles with indirect tax?
Getting probably the input. Okay, when you have your output and your input.
You are comparing indirect tax principles with direct tax principles. That's the point I'm making. Please.
Yeah, so the point I'm making is that levy generally is just a one-off thing, and it is based on probably a certain figure. And I was giving the National Fiscal Stabilization Levy where we take 5%, and if you make profit before tax, then you pay. If you don't, you don't pay anything. The other issue is that the E-Levy is not on your savings. It's not on your savings. It is only when you want to move the savings and use the money for transactions. And I think that we need to be clear on that, because even with the E-Levy, when you move funds from your account to your phone, and it is the same name, the same account, you don't pay anything. It is exempt. You can even move funds from, let's say, your MTN and to your Voda card. Okay, so once it's established that it's the same person, you don't pay anything. So let's get that point right.
Okay, so point made there. But when it comes to an IMF program, I mean, we've even had Dr. Sibe, who has been an integral member of the Finance Committee in the past, say that, look, it is the way to go. Bite the bullet now. And you can play with this E-Levy thing. But if you look at what the E-Levy is going to, even projected, even if we had got the 6.9 billion, looking at our different ratios, tax to GDP, looking at even the components when it comes to the 2022 budget, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the IMF program and what we could rake in. So on that, in that regard, Eric, I'd like to find out from you. Though you say you are not for us going the way of the IMF currently, have we played too much politics with the IMF program? Because you would see a plethora of tweets from the past. The last one I saw from Gabi Otredako pointing to the fact that, we're always bringing the government or the state out of an IMF program, suggesting that it is bad to be in an IMF program. We all know that that is not necessarily the case. So have we played too much politics with it to the point where now, if we have to go there, we have sort of, shot ourselves in the foot?
Okay, what I want to say is that government has to look at its expenditure. Okay, I believe that there are certain areas that government spends money on that we can cut down drastically. I think a few weeks ago, this issue of the ex-gratia, it came up. And if you ask me, why should somebody, by virtue of the fact that he's an Article 71 holder, go on and still earning what he's earning or she is earning, and at the same time, the person lives off it, apart from the fact that the person is going to be on the salary that he was earning before he or she left? Why should the person be paid that ex gratia? I think that as a nation, it's high time that we prioritize areas which are critical to the state. We must look at things that we can do that will help to increase revenue, increase output, so that we can move on as a nation. And I was told that we haven't been able to exhaust all the. If the government to cut down its expenditure, if you look at some of the SOEs, the CEOs, how much they are earning.
Right.
We're having a discussion on it. If somebody is the CEO of a state-owned enterprise, and this enterprise is making losses year in, year out, why should that person be receiving so much money? And so what I'm saying is that we're able to look at all these areas very well and cut down on government expenditure. Whilst we try to explore other areas that we can increase the revenue, we don't need to go to the IMF.
All right. Two quick questions. Seth, I know you would have been next in line, but I just want to exhaust these with Dr. Theo Champong as well, and I'll give you ample time to react. Dr. Theo Champong, have we overborrowed, so to speak, as some suggest, that maybe we've done too much borrowing and now it's become an albatross around our neck in tricky economic waters? And secondly, have we played too much politics with the IMF program to the extent that if we have to go because of our previous comments, our previous vitriolic attacks on going the way of the IMF, now it becomes very difficult? Two questions I hope you can address very quickly. Hello, Dr. Champong, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I went off briefly. If you can repeat the questions.
So I was asking you, have we played too much politics with going the way of the IMF to the point where maybe we would have harmed ourselves if we now have to go back? Because in the past we were so fiercely against it, talking about, we are always bringing the country out of the IMF, and now we have to go back. And some people have also spoken about the fact that we have simply borrowed way too much. And now the least shocks to the economy, and we're reeling. Your quick reaction to those?
Yeah, so let me start from the latter part. In terms of the borrowing amount, yes, high, but I also think fundamentally the Ghanaian economy is too over-liberalized. Some numbers I've seen and some others indicate that as much as 70–80% of the economy is liberalized, and to that extent, any of these external shocks or the least one basically throws a lot of your numbers out of gear, and so we need to think more about domestic substitution and grow more of the things that we can eat ourselves, and then subsequently export the rest. The big elephant in the room, or the issue is, the politics of going to the IMF I absolutely agree with you. You know, between the two main parties, the NDC and the MPP, they've always used the going to the IMF as a political tool, and they even have used that for campaigns. I recall very well, you know, during Uncle Seth's tenure, certain statements that were made by the then opposition saying that we have shot ourselves in the foot, and going to the IMF was literally going to beg, and it's a master-servant relationship, all of those things. And now the foot is on the banner is on the other foot, where again we're also seeing a similar reaction now from the opposition NDC, you know, trying to capitalize on the political outcomes of going to the IMF or not. What this tells me really is that we have not had an honest conversation with ourselves as a country, and even fundamentally come to the point that certain things that we need to do ourselves have not been fully implemented. And when governments change power, certain policy actions then basically are dropped. What we need to do is to sit around the table and have a clear plan of action of what we're going to do as a country for the next 5 to 10 years, right? What are we going to do on industrialization? What are we going to do on improving productivity in the public service and across the board? What are we going to do on tax reform? What are we going to do on strengthening the monetary policy mechanisms of the central bank? Because sometimes the inflation targeting regime clearly doesn't work. Those are things that fundamentally we need to sit down and address ourselves without necessarily bringing the IMF into the equation. Because after all, if you look at many of the homegrown policies and even what the government is proposing to do now, it's not any different from what the IMF would tell you to do anyway, except that, yes, they bring some quote unquote policy credibility in that respect. And it's like the proverbial headmaster holding the stick and trying to get you to do the right thing in that sense. So, I mean, for this, I blame both parties. They've played the politics of, you know, going to the IMF to their advantage, and that in a way has poisoned the atmosphere such that any government that goes, the opposition would take that as a political tool and try and use that to gain votes in that regard. And that for me is a little bit unfortunate, but that is how the political economy of Ghana unfortunately is.
To you now, Seth Tekpe, and again, it's always good using you as a reference point because you've been there, you've done that. You've gone to an IMF program. Have we played too much politics with going the way of the IMF? Secondly, have we borrowed too much, which has made us exposed as far as our economy is concerned and the economic hurdles we are currently facing? And maybe more importantly, among all the three questions I am pushing to you, is it time now for us to go the way of the IMF? Your quick reaction.
Well, your second point first, and I like to go to the numbers. On the rebased 2013 basis, our debt ratio was 57% approximately. Today, we are going to end above 80%, no question. We ended last year above 80%. Forget about the politics or the question of option of bailout and others. That's where we landed. Now, as a middle income country with market access, if we want to have a B ratings, not even to talk about B plus, which is where we have been falling the 2015, 2016 crude oil price and the rest, we should be between 55 and 65%. So it depends on market confidence. Where do we want to go? It's about goals, it's about targets, right? So if we want to restore our ratings, not exclusively on debt, but on the debt index, then for B minus, B plus, we currently see we should be between, at least 60, 65, to be, reasonable shot of being in the top echelon of B minus. So we should know the context in which we are talking. So if you look at that and you are looking at 80, possibly 85%, if GDP doesn't, increase, fast enough this year, then it means you are way off. And from where you came, it is going to be difficulty getting back into that. Now, should we go to the IMF or not? What is the market? What are the numbers telling us? we are using, we know them already. So let me just go over them quickly. We've discussed it even on the show. Compensation and interest is taking all of tax revenue and a substantial portion of total revenue, which means that you are borrowing, for recurrent expenditure, you are borrowing for capital expenditure, which you should do. Above all, you are borrowing for repayment of past debt, right? If you don't have a solution, and I've said if you are not going to the IMF, show me the solution for these things. How are you going to raise revenue? And in fact, to Eric's point, I mean, we know as tax experts that it takes 2 to 3 years to raise your tax to GDP ratio by 2 percentage points of GDP. That's the research by both World Bank, African Development Bank, and the IMF, right? And it takes consistent reforms, such as the ones I enumerated already. If you do not automate, you cannot move because it requires structural measures. It's not ad hoc, sending somebody to go and do all this or the rest. If you want to tax the multinationals and the rest, they are automated, right? So you also automate. And then you use computer-assisted audit techniques, no manual audit techniques, to go into their systems, to do the audit, to collect information on their activities based on their tax number, like, let me use a familiar area where you can bear me out. All the oil services sector that are new to our economy, what are they doing?
Right.
What are we collecting? And people are withholding taxes, on payments they are making to them. We do not have a database to bring them and see how much, they are doing, and they are declaring their own, numbers. So I'm saying we need to move to strengthen GRA with a solid domestic tax administration system, training, following the merger of IRS and VAT, bringing the two together substantively. They are together, but nominally. Those are the reforms. That was going to be the phase 2, of the reforms. Now, if we don't go to the IMF now, right, I have more questions. Are we able to weather the Ukraine war for as long as it takes? The G7 just met, right, and they are saying they are in for the long haul, which means that, quote, what they are saying is that we expect this to extend maybe to the end of the year or the rest. Are we able, to weather with our current condition, the inflationary things, the adjustments which the global central banks are doing, and now we are doing syndicated loans. Even if we were in the markets ordinarily, we would be borrowing at rates that now account, which are going to be higher because of the global interest rate. So I'm saying that's another factor we need to consider, right? Given our current situation, are we able to, to harbor this? If crude oil prices continue to grow, if grains don't come, for wheat to go to, our 2 major wheat producers, bread and the rest. Those are the factors we should be talking about when we talk, about this. Now, IMF.
Yes, quickly. What would your answer be? Would we be able to weather the storm? Would we be able to weather the storm? If it's a no, then it means we must go.
Not with the figure. Certainly not, because you can't even. You have arrears. You have school for school children and all that. So how do you weather? You do it. That's my point.
Okay.
And that is another consideration. If there is an alternative, I'd like to know, right? But I'm saying that, where is the pride? Didn't we go back to the IMF for COVID loan? If we were that solid, why didn't we stomach it ourselves? Didn't we the SDR, the countries that have the wherewithal, when they got their SDR, some of the middle income and almost all the advanced countries, what did they do? They divided it, used some of them to create their own buffers, and gave the rest out, to countries like ours, by way of aid and the rest. I mean, if you want to, with a certain club, you have to do the fundamentals, for you to be there. I do not see, how we are. By the way, let me also answer this question,
and maybe just briefly, because we have to go. So this will be the final point.
Hope don't want to answer a critical one of the home goals, particularly the stabilization fund and the second fund. So let me just focus on those. What has the problems that have been buffeting the economy? It is because commodity prices keep going up and down. Forget about Ukraine war and the rest, even those minor ones, right? Then periodically you have the major ones like COVID, global financial crisis, or the war. what countries do is that create budget buffers. And the evidence is there. What was our first recourse for COVID? It was our own stabilization fund, $250 million US. If it hadn't been saved in the past, would we have it? Didn't the past government that saved it? Didn't they have their own pressing needs as well? Today we have 3 oil fields. We should have built that fund by now with the 3 oil fields when the time were good to maybe 500, 700, 800. And the next time you have a crisis, you fall on your own resources up to about 500, no 250. That is how you win yourself off the IMF. That is what, the middle income countries and the rest, those were the structures they put in place.
Right.
We talked before the last point, I said 2 examples. We saw, the first sovereign bond staring us in the face in 2014. What did we do? We had necessities, especially in 2015, 2016. When crude oil prices fell, we went to parliament to reduce expenditures, including E-Levy and the rest. But we continued to put the money aside. By the time we were leaving office, we had taken 336 million from the sinking fund, oil revenue. To take off that, we left 250 million. The NPP used 200 million. It's not about politics, 200 million on the maturity date, October 4th, 2017, to pay off the rest. That is how, you respond to the markets. That is how mature economies respond to the markets. So these are the structures that we need to build. It is not that we did not start. Then you introduce things like which reduce the debt burden.
Right.
You ring-fence airports, airport tax, for example, for Terminal 3. Today, we don't know whether that money has been put back into the budget.
So a lot of food for thought, a lot to reflect on. But gentlemen, we're immensely grateful that you took the time to join us for this conversation. Dr. Theo Champong, an economist. Doc, thank you for making the time. Eric Amponsah-Boateng, a tax analyst. Thank you for joining the conversation as well. And Seth Tekpe, former Minister for Finance and Economic Planning. Gentlemen, we're very grateful for your time.
Thank you very much.
Right. And after all that talk and the brain work, well, it's time for us to take a drink. Awake is premium purified water treated through a strict purification process to ensure that every bottle on the market refreshes you better. We have the perfect size for every occasion. 330 and 500 ml bottles to fit your pockets and bags. 750 ml for the heavy drinkers and 1.5 liters for those who always want more. We have also introduced our special 19-liter jars for offices and homes. Now, you just need to stay awake with Awake Purified Drinking Water wherever you go. I recommend it for you. So come on, grab a bottle of Awake Water and get quality hydration. Awake Purified Drinking Water, one for life. Remember, for every bottle you purchase, an amount is donated to the National Cardiothoracic Center. It's produced by Casa Prego. For bulk purchases, just call that number, 0262 351 251. We'll take a breather. We'll be right back.